March 25th, 1991. The Shrine Auditorium, Los Angeles. The cameras were everywhere. Red carpet, flash bulbs, television crews from dozens of networks, journalists who had been assigned to this building since before sunrise. It was the 63rd Academy Awards, one of the most watched evenings in American television, and by 7 o'clock, nearly every significant name in entertainment had arrived or was arriving. And then 2 cars pulled up, one after the other, and Michael Jackson and Madonna stepped onto the carpet together. The photographs from that night tell a particular story. Michael, in a gold military jacket, tailored to a precision that made him look like something between a general and a painting. Madonna, in an ice-blonde Marilyn Monroe look, a dress that announced its intention from 20 feet away. Beside each other, in that light, in front of those cameras, they looked like something the entertainment industry had produced on purpose. 2 icons, assembled for maximum effect, dressed to outshine everything else in the room. What the photographs do not show is what happened before they stepped out of the car, and what happened in the hours that followed, away from the cameras and the flashbulbs and the press corps that spent most of the night trying to decide whether they were rivals or allies. That part of the story belongs to a smaller group of people, the ones who were close enough to watch and quiet enough to actually see. By 1991, the Academy Awards occupied a particular place in American culture, not just as a film industry event, but as one of the last great occasions when the entire architecture of celebrity converged in a single room. Actors, directors, musicians, politicians, all of them present, all of them visible, all of them measured against each other in a way that almost no other event in the world still produced. The red carpet was not simply a path into a building, it was a statement. What you wore, who you arrived with, how you moved through the photographers, all of it was read and interpreted and debated the following morning in newspapers across the country. Michael Jackson had been navigating this kind of scrutiny since he was 9 years old. By 1991, he had spent more than 2 decades living inside a public narrative that bore only a partial resemblance to anything he could control. He had won more awards than almost anyone alive. He had sold more records. He had performed on more stages, and yet, and this was the part that rarely made it into the profiles and the features, he had never fully learned to be comfortable in rooms like this one. Rooms where the performance was not music or dance, but simply the act of being present, of moving through a crowd, of saying the right thing to the right person at exactly the right moment. In March 1991, Michael was between 2 of the most significant chapters of his career. Dangerous, the album that would follow Bad, was still being made. He was deep in recording sessions, building something that would eventually sell over 30 million copies. The creative pressure was considerable. But the public pressure was something different again. By this point, the mythology around Michael Jackson had grown so large that almost every public appearance carried a weight that most performers would find difficult to imagine. He was not simply a musician who attended events. He was, by this point, a symbol. And symbols, by their nature, are not permitted to be ordinary. What those close to him during this period often described was a man who was most comfortable in 2 places, in the studio and on the stage. Every other setting, parties, dinners, award shows, press events, required a version of himself that did not come as naturally. He could perform it. He was, after all, one of the greatest performers who had ever lived. But performing it and feeling it were 2 different things. Those who worked alongside him consistently noted that the Michael who sat in a recording booth at 2 in the morning trying a vocal line 16 different ways until it was exactly right, was a different person from the Michael who walked a red carpet. One of those settings felt like home. The other never quite did. Madonna understood this distinction with a clarity that very few other people in her industry shared. By 1991, she had built one of the most deliberately constructed public identities in the history of entertainment. An image that was simultaneously authentic and manufactured, personal and strategic, vulnerable and armored. She had spent a decade controlling her own narrative with a precision that even her critics found impressive. She understood, perhaps better than almost anyone alive in 1991, what it meant to be a public figure whose private self existed in a completely separate register from everything the public believed they were seeing. The press, naturally, had spent years framing the relationship between Michael and Madonna as a rivalry. They occupied the same commercial universe, the same charts, the same television specials, the same cultural conversation. To the entertainment press of the late 1980s and early 1990s, any two figures of comparable fame were automatically in competition with each other. It was a simpler story, and a more entertaining one. Rivalry sold covers. Mutual respect did not. And so the rivalry became the story, repeated often enough that most people simply accepted it as the shape of things. But inside the industry, among the producers and directors and musicians who moved in the same spaces as both of them, the picture was considerably more complicated. Both of them were known, separately, for being extraordinarily private off stage. Both of them had developed elaborate systems for managing the distance between their public personas and their actual inner lives. And both of them, in various private contexts, had spoken of each other with a degree of consideration that the rivalry narrative consistently failed to accommodate. Inside the Shrine Auditorium, before the broadcast began, there was the particular kind of controlled chaos that precedes a major live event. Producers moving through the aisles with clipboards, presenters being walked through their cues, seat fillers standing by, the orchestra running through cue sheets in the pit, and throughout all of it, the constant movement of famous faces, nodding, smiling, shaking hands, performing the ambient social theater that events like this require. Michael and Madonna moved through it differently. Michael with the careful, almost deliberate quality that marked his public appearances in this period, aware of every eye in the room, choosing each movement with the kind of precision he usually reserved for the stage. Madonna with a looser, more combative ease. She had been performing for rooms like this her entire adult life, and she had long since stopped finding them anything other than a familiar exercise in controlled exposure. At some point in the early evening, before the ceremony began, the two of them found themselves in a corridor backstage. A production assistant, reviewing footage from that evening years later, described the moment as unremarkable in every visible way. Two people in a hallway, a brief stop in an otherwise busy night. What made it remarkable was not anything that could have been filmed. It was something that could only be described afterward, by the people close enough to observe it, in terms that did not quite translate into the kind of language that press coverage usually reached for. What happened in that corridor has been described in slightly different terms by the different people who later spoke about it. The general shape, however, is consistent. Michael said something, and Madonna did not respond the way either of them might have expected. It was not a performance. It was not a statement prepared for any audience. It was a question, spoken quietly, in the kind of tone people use when they are not playing a role, when they are simply asking. It was about the evening itself, about what it felt like to stand in the middle of all of it, to be watched this closely by this many people for this long, and whether any of it, after all of it, ever felt the way it was supposed to feel. Madonna paused. The pause itself was notable. She was not, by reputation or practice, someone who paused before speaking. In almost every interview, every public appearance, every filmed encounter, she moved through her answers with the confidence of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by her own thoughts. And yet she paused, and when she spoke, it was in the same quiet register Michael had used. Not a deflection, not a performance, not the sharp, pre-loaded response that most people expected from her in professional settings. She answered directly. And what she said was close enough to what Michael had meant by the question that both of them, by most accounts, seemed briefly, genuinely surprised. What followed was not a long conversation, perhaps 5 minutes, maybe less. A few sentences exchanged in a backstage corridor while the rest of the building moved around them. Assistants and producers and crew members navigating the space with the focused efficiency of people on a live broadcast deadline. But something about those few minutes was different from the rest of the evening. Not because of what was said. The specifics have never been fully recorded, and those who were close enough to hear chose, in most cases, to keep what they heard to themselves. But because of what it looked like from the outside. Two people who were, by any reasonable measure, among the most guarded public figures in the world, standing in a corridor, talking quietly, without any of the usual apparatus of performance or strategy. No cameras, no publicists hovering at the edges, no visible calculation about how the moment would read. For those who knew both of them, who understood how rarely either of them allowed the layers to drop, even briefly, even in private, it was, by those accounts, a remarkable thing to observe. Not dramatic, not historic in any obvious way, simply two people in a corridor, briefly being exactly what they were, without the room watching. The ceremony proceeded. The cameras returned. The evening took on the shape that the photographs would later record. The two of them in the audience, the gold jacket, the ice-blonde dress, the shot that editors would choose for the following morning's entertainment pages, and that would appear in retrospectives for decades afterward. The story that accompanied those photographs was the story the press had already decided to tell. Spectacle, calculation. Two mega-brands occupying the same frame. It was not a wrong story, but it was, by most accounts of that evening, an incomplete one. In the years that followed, Madonna spoke rarely and carefully about Michael Jackson, enough to make clear that she regarded him with a respect that went beyond the professional, but never in terms specific enough to give journalists a usable headline. Michael, characteristically, said almost nothing publicly about their relationship at all. What both of them left behind was mostly silence, and the occasional, carefully chosen word that suggested the silence was deliberate. What that evening revealed, to those paying close enough attention, was something that would be difficult to understand without knowing both of them clearly. Fame, at a certain level, does not connect people. It isolates them. It builds a particular kind of wall that is invisible to almost everyone except the people standing behind it. And the only people who can ever fully see that wall are the ones who are standing behind one of their own. Michael Jackson and Madonna were, by 1991, two of the most isolated people in the world, in a specific way that had nothing to do with loneliness in the ordinary sense. They were surrounded by people. They were never alone in a room. But the particular experience of inhabiting a public identity that had grown beyond any individual's ability to fully control, That experience was shared by almost nobody. It was the one condition neither of them could explain to anyone who had not lived it firsthand. And for 5 minutes in a backstage corridor, on the evening of the 63rd Academy Awards, that shared condition was simply acknowledged. No cameras, no agenda. Two people who understood each other in one very specific way, saying so briefly, and then returning to the evening. The photographs from that night remain: the gold jacket, the ice blonde dress, the red carpet, the flashbulbs. It is one of the most reproduced images of either of their careers, a picture that has been used to illustrate stories about rivalry, about image, about the spectacle of celebrity at its most concentrated. And somewhere behind those photographs, in a corridor that no camera reached, something smaller and more honest happened. Something that the people who saw it chose not to describe at length, because the description would have required them to explain something the evening itself had briefly made clear: that there are forms of understanding between people that do not announce themselves, that do not photograph well, and that are, for exactly that reason, the only forms of understanding that last. Most people remember that night as spectacle. That is what the cameras were there to record. What happened when the cameras were pointed the other way was something else entirely.